Welcome back to section 3 of our discussion. And special thanks to Mr. Berkowitz for bringing us some great port wine, the official drink of the 18th century. Phenomenal. One might assume after the tenon had been driven deep into the mortise, the peg holes were then drilled. Not so. To really snug fit any joint as tightly as possible, the peg holes were offset by draw boring between 1/8 and 1/4 inch. The tenon would be drawn to its fullest extent into the mortise. Drift wedge, or hook pin, rather than risk a fractured pin in the drawing together of a joint, the drift wedge was an unbreakable but temporary substitute. The tapered iron, or sheet pin, drew the mortise and tenon together as tightly as possible. Then, when its job was done, it was pried or hammered out using the end hook. The bored holes were more in line, although slightly offset. It was time for actually pegging to begin. And by the way, we're possibly having a severe thunderstorm here, so we may lose power, so just in case everybody. Okay, tree nails. Pegs were the tree nails, or trunnels, that could lock the joints together for keeps. The colonial builders must have been pleasured to secure all their wooden framework together with all wooden nails. So if you want to know what's original, you got to find the wooden nails. Yankees made to do with the raw materials that was at hand. And this was part of our independent spirit as being Americans and colonists here. And that made the actual American Revolution quite inevitable. The post and beam foundation, spring was fast approaching. The mortise and tenon timbers were stacked for slow drying in the still, cool weather, hopefully free from checks, with the frozen ground in the more northerly colonies becoming workable. Attention could be given to the foundation. So we've felled our timber, we've drug it, we've mortise tended it, we've hewn it, and now we've waited. Our foundation as our beginning. Local field stones were there for the taking, or clay could be baked into local bricks. It was prudent to lay their base a foot or so below the frost line for a heave less footing. In those fortunate colonies that were free from freezing weather, digging trenches to a depth of 2 feet or so would give quite the firm foundation. Since many homes of the period could boast of a cellar, the whereabouts of the frost line was of little matter. The foundation was built at least 8 inches above the earth. The field stones were dry laid out without mortar, while bricks were laid with lime mortar. In either case, they were laid 1 over 2 to span any gaps that each would be on the level, regardless of the slope of the land. Dovetailed joints. To master joiners, the dovetail joint looked much like that of the tail of a dove in flight. This remarkable joint could be lowered into the still mortises without disassembling. Once wedged in place, any outward pull from the sills would lock the dovetail more firmly in place. Unlike in the use of other joints, there was no need for pegging. Now we can see here, just looking at a drawer in our French secretaire, that we have dovetail joints on the ends. So when you pull the front, the drawer doesn't come apart. Floor joists must have given the post and beam builders a degree of pleasure. The log need only be debarked in a single face, hewn to receiving the floor. Often the under ends of the joists beveled to relieve a degree of stress on the dovetail junction. The girders, those weight-bearing big brothers of the joist, required extra sill support with the dovetail joints. It was an American original and would later be invaluable. The summer beam was lowered and tied into the bent sections. Bents. Bents were pre-assembled sections that made up the width of the frame. Usually there were 4. The 2 ends and the 2 sections between them. The bent members were joined flat on the foundation, timber, and in position to be raised in place. Raising day. Everything was in readiness on the day to assemble You had your neighbors, your friends, your family. It may have well taken a year since the first tree was felled to the day when another new American landmark could be created. Being a good neighbor never meant more than on raising day, and you created good neighbors at that point. By dawn, the villagers had largely gathered at the building site with their hearth, good cooked food, drink, gossip, goodwill, music makers, and above all, plenty of muscle. There was the same anticipation of later Independence Day celebrations, for these were special times, never to be forgotten. And many of these times are written or scribed in a lot of the timber of these buildings. The bents were positioned on the temporary boards that covered the flooring timber. These were stacked and numbered frame pieces that included connecting girts that would secure the bents, the corner braces, the second floor and attic joists, the summer beams, and the rafters that would be raised, joined and seated to receive their share of the purlins. All this took the organization of a field general that had the know-how of a master house framer and a keen eye for any pitfalls that may lie ahead during the day. Usually the responsibility fell upon the shoulders of the head or lead carpenter. Joining the bents, the front and back girts were raised and their tenons were eased into the corner post mortise, at the same time as the knee braces were positioned. Then the pins were pounded home. The next step was to tilt the second bent off enough to be joined with the girt and its braces. Once pegged, the box-lock partial frame was ready to be locked together forever with a summer beam. The summer beam. This massive, weight-bearing timber, often the heaviest of the entire framework of the dwelling, tied the two bents together. The name had nothing to do with any of the seasons. Likely it was a corruption of the Old English word sumpter, meaning a pack horse or mule that carried heavy, heavy loads. So it was with a summer beam, for it carried the second floor joist as a midway support system. Once the two bents had been joined by the connecting girts to form a four-sided box, the summer beam was raised and then lowered into position. Like the first floor girts, the summer beam was forever wedged in place with the housed dovetail joints. Unlike the major joining, there was no need to drill and pin the joint. Because the summer beam was of such size, it projected well into the room below. A few runs with a molding plane could turn it into an architectural feature. And many of these are hidden and boxed in. So if any of your houses out in the audience have these and they're boxed in, take them apart. And most of them have a nice beveled chamfer, at times terminating with a lamb's tongue. The OG and head were a bit more elegant. Whatever the design, the decorative molding ended with various chamfer stops. Let's go up to the roof. Let's talk about shingles. Early colonists carried on the old English tradition of roof thatching. The topping of previously bounded bundles of reeds and or straw required a sharply pitched roof up to about 60 degrees. This hurried off heavy soaking rains. Rows of horizontal sticks were nailed to the rafters to secure the thatching. But well before the last quarter of the 17th century had begun, blustery winds and downpours on this side of the Atlantic could turn the straw into bundles of overhead sponges. Shingles split from oak, cypress, chestnut, and white pine were the weather-worthy answers. When laid in overlapping rows and nailed to 1x3 thatch purlins, water quickly drained down the fibrous grooves in the split surfaces. Underneath, a free circulation of air prevented rot. A gentler rafter slope of 45 degrees, that all that was needed. The new roofing could well last a lifetime. Before many years, the entire framework could be sheathed in sawn boards, making the thatched purlins obsolete. Laying the shingles. The exposed weather face was 1/3 the length of a shingle. So if you had a 24-inch shingle, you've had 1-inch exposure and 2 hidden. It will result in triple coverage of your cedar shingles or cedar shakes. Therefore, at any one place, there will be at least 3 thicknesses of shingles. Nails. Nails were scarce and expensive. Dwellings that had outlived their useful purpose frequently were burned down just for their nails.